Welcome to our next video in this series. Today we are talking about how can AI writing tools help neurodivergent learners. Either of you have any thoughts on that?
So I'll just start off with kind of a prompt is I think one thing that I've seen in working with neurodivergent learners is that a lot of us have learning goals, and a lot of our learners have specific support needs, and they have areas that are challenging for them. And so I would just kind of start off with asking, like, what are some types of challenges that we see, and what kinds of skills would be important to help them to develop in a supported sort of fashion. And then for families to just really think about what are your learning goals in the smaller picture, but also in the larger picture. And then what kinds of skills do you need to develop for the future?
I was thinking about, so my daughter has dyslexia and she also had dysgraphia. And I was thinking if this existed a few years ago when she was like really in the nitty gritty of learning how to read and write, I wondered like how we might use this. And I do think that although, like I don't think I would have had her use it all the time. I do think like in moments of intense frustration, um, we could have definitely made use of this to do some summaries, to condense things so that she could read more quickly, especially like, like word problems, which she still actually struggles with still. And, like having it maybe re-summarize word problems, or simplify word problems, or just simplify some text, so that it's easier to read. Um, I think that those would have been really useful tools to have. I also think about like in writing center, we see a lot of students with language processing disorders, and they often tell me, like I know exactly what I want to say in my head, but it just never comes out that way. And I think that the conversational style of things like ChatGPT could make this a much more fluid process for those learners, like where they can write something down. Maybe it's not what they want to say, but they can put it in, and then they can, start to have conversations with the chatbot to kind of narrow it down to what they do want it to say. And I can imagine that being a lot less isolating and frustrating than if you're just trying to do this alone, like on your computer or on pen and paper by yourself.
Yeah, it's one of those times like in our last video, you had both mentioned sort of that emotional response. I think it's one of those times where that, even though there's some risk to that, where that could be a benefit for to feel, like you said, less alone. I will say I am a neurodivergent person myself, raising neurodivergent kids with lots of neurodivergent learners. So this is something I think about all of the time. And I am in some like Facebook groups for neurodivergent people, like to help them with like cleaning tasks or cooking tasks or like day-to-day executive functioning. And several people in there have said how ChatGPT has helped make day-to-day tasks so much easier for them because they will just type in like meal plan for me for the week and ChatGPT will spit back a list and like, no, I am a vegetarian, so do it without any meat, or I don't have tomatoes, or like, and the response model of it is instead of having to go out and find, all these different recipes and try to collate that and figure out what ingredients you have and don't have, you can just kind of do it conversationally. And it's really helping people just manage a task, that like giving them a set of like, okay, this is what I'm doing. Now I have a plan, and getting over some of those early hurdles to being able to tap into the parts of the cognitive process that are easier for them, that are sometimes blocked by that early stage of figuring out what to do next. And so I feel like that is applicable beyond just, grocery lists or figuring out what to clean in your house first. But I think learners in a variety of settings could use that to help them figure out what steps to do and to get started on a task that feels overwhelming.
Yeah, both of those are great examples. Candace, in thinking about students who have that language processing where they know what they want to say, but they just have trouble phrasing it the right way, I could see potential for being able to even practice with ChatGPT, to practice different ways of phrasing it, and to not have to deal with, yeah, being embarrassed or being under pressure and such. That I think there could be a lot of value in just having that lower pressure environment to be able to practice in. And it's funny because there was a program back in, I think, the 70s called ELIZA. And it was a very early language substitution model that was created to basically be a therapist. And you can find it online. And basically you just start talking to it and it will substitute in language. So it'll say, hi, what would you like to talk about today? And then you talk about it. It says, well, tell me more about blah. And it was a very crude, rudimentary sort of program, but I see a lot of similarities in that interactivity aspect, and in just having someone to be able to bounce these ideas off of, in a who is non-judgmental. It's a computer. It's not going to get tired of you. That there's a lot of value in there. Um, and I'm also thinking about how in coding, it's oftentimes challenging because you have to get the syntax correct. You have to put punctuations in all the right places, and if one thing is off, the program won't compile. And so, a lot of introductory programming, uh, pro, like Scratch, for example, designed by MIT, uses block coding. So they actually have little funny shapes that have the different coding instructions on them, and then you fit them together to create your program. And block coding has become very popular, especially for younger learners or for newer coders, because they get to focus on assembling the concepts in a way that makes sense, and that they can just assemble it to design that framework for the program they want to do. And understanding that larger architecture, how those ideas fit together, is the more important thing for them to do. And then later, as they learn particular coding languages, then they get to figure out exactly what the details are in the syntax. And I see a similar potential for basically avoiding excessive frustration for learners who are trying to learn grammar and syntax and such. Where if they're able to get this structure in a more accessible sort of way, that they can then focus on the content. Through repetition, they'll get to learn the grammar and the punctuation and structuring and such as well. But they won't have their initial enthusiasm and interest, damped down because they got so frustrated with getting the grammar wrong. So there's definitely precedent for having assisted learning and creation in these sorts of ways.
Your examples there just made me think about the tips I already give when parents and guardians who are homeschooling ask me, like, well, how can I scaffold this writing assignment for my learner who is struggling with this task? And it doesn't even have to be a neurodivergence. I mean, writing is
Yeah.
hard. Writing is hard no matter who you are, and what skills you're bringing to the table. Even if you are a professional writer, it still can be days when it is really hard. But I think that, I'll say things like, well, figure out, because there's so many tasks involved in writing, right? You have to figure out what it is you think, and then you have to figure out how to communicate it. Then you have to figure out what order it goes in. And I'm saying and then as if that's like an A, B, C, but it isn't, right? Like sometimes it's all of them at the same time, or maybe you have an order first, but you don't know what to put into it yet. And so whenever you can kind of, your block coding example made me think about it. Like if you can identify what is the importance of this lesson? And if ChatGPT can do one of the pieces that you're not focused on in that lesson, then do it, right? Like if this is not a lesson on organization, let ChatGPT make the outline and let them fill it in. I wouldn't say that that's an ethical or great thing to do all of the time, but I think that that is a fine way to use a tool to take off some of the cognitive load so that your learner has enough frustration tolerance left to handle the task that is most important in that moment.
And that's a perfect case for, there can be perfect transparency, and the teacher could even suggest it. I mean, I've had a couple students where they had trouble getting started with the organization, and I said, would it be helpful if I set up an outline first? And so that similar way where a teacher could, would be assisting the student, or would be providing an example, or they ask for an example of a similar type of essay. That, yeah, those are absolutely places where we can just transparently use a tool like ChatGPT and say, well, let's try this, or let's try to generate this, or generate one and then send it to me, and let me see if it looks okay to start with, and then you can work from that. And yeah, that absolutely could be a really great way for all sorts of learners to kind of get over some of those hurdles, so that they can develop those other skills first, and then we can work on other ones later.
I was thinking too, it can be very helpful for just explicit instruction, like just making a whole host of things more transparent, like just asking ChatGPT, which steps should I take to do this kind of assignment, and just I know as a parent, like that would be very helpful for me because sometimes I'm not always sure what the steps are, or I've become so used to doing them that it's hard for me to kind of pull them apart. But just figuring out like what would be a logical sequencing of tasks to get through something complicated. I think that that could be, and since students can do it themselves too, like they don't necessarily even need the guidance of the teacher or their parent. They could ask it to help them with these things, and that could really empower, I think, a lot of writers and give them more agency.
Yeah, and I I think that have having tools available to learners, 'cause, I was a learner who had trouble asking for help. I still have trouble asking. And that yeah, there's a lot of learners who may not be in a place where they feel like they can ask the teacher for help, or they feel uncomfortable and whatnot. So at least that gives them something to try, and especially if the teacher directly gives the okay and says, "If you get stuck and don't wanna come to me yet, here's a tool you can try first, but please, anything that you generate there, run it by me." And so that gives them something that is easy for them to do, to try out and to try to at least feel like they've made progress in some sorts of ways, or to just create something that lets you start from. Because I think our brains tend to be really good at critiquing things that we see in front of us, even if, especially if they're imperfect. And that can be a lot easier than just trying to come up with something whole cloth. That was mentioned in the previous video was the study buddy idea, and I just wanted to mention that again. That a lot of learners, they want to have the feeling that they are working alongside somebody else, and so having something like ChatGPT is almost an accountability buddy to check in with or to talk with, that could potentially be very useful.
I often ask students to free write, which is where you write with no expectation of showing it to the teacher. You're just dumping out your ideas, you're letting them flow, you don't stop to correct your grammar. And a lot of them struggle with that as a concept. Like they're like, okay, but what do I write about? I'm like, you just have to let it flow. And like, but I think that maybe if it was a model, more conversational model where you could just put your first ideas, I'm like, what do you think about that? And then ChatGPT is giving you something back, you're gonna feel more engaged and more welcome to continue that conversation. I will caution that we mentioned in I don't remember how many videos earlier it was now, but we did mention the emotional risks of a model that could then end up, making you feel like is somebody listening to you, and the content that it comes up with, it doesn't have intentions. And so that content it could get into emotional territory and feel manipulative to somebody who isn't prepared to really navigate and think about that. So I do think using that tool would require some monitoring, especially for younger writers, just to make sure that their conversations with ChatGPT were not getting overly personal or in a way that was going to make them vulnerable. But I think that it just having that back and forth to get your ideas down on the page could be really helpful.
I believe our next video, we're going to talk about some other things to be aware of in terms of the content that was used to train ChatGPT. That some of it may have some problematic ideas, some structural bias like racism and sexism, anti-LGBTQIA ideas and such. And so yeah, there's several reasons for just monitoring and being cautious, as with all types of social interactions, whether they're in person or online, to just make sure you check in, just to make sure that things aren't going oddly off the rails and ChatGPT isn't telling them to leave their spouse or something. That might be a little confusing.
All right, so there are some ways that we think you might be able to use AI writing tools to help neurodivergent learners, and we hope that you'll try them out and let us know how they go if you have been using them or if you've got other ideas. In our next video, we're going to be talking about, can AI writing tools be used ethically, which is, I think, kind of the million-dollar question here. So hope you'll tune in for that one.